Welcome to Anomacast, Episode 5, Negative Capability. This week we're going to tackle a meta-anomalies topic. For all of you who have not heard of our web community, Meta-Anomalies, we are a community of communities, heuristically trying to understand how to build communities. This week we're going to deal with a topic which I think is very close to my heart, and that is truth and certainty, and the cost of certainty. Now, today's episode may be cut a little bit short because I have some things I have to attend to, but Pete, why don't you start out by giving us a little bit of a background on negative capability?
Okay, hiya. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, there's a famous English romantic poet called John Keats. He wrote the famous poem Ode to a Nightingale, and he wrote some also in some letters. He wrote a lot of letters, and in one of his letters he wrote an interesting piece about what he called negative capability, which is a sort of state which he felt that poets functioned best when a mental state in which they function best. And he describes it as basically being capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts in your mind without any irritable reaching after fact or reason. In other words, that old definition of the intellectual as one who can hold two opinions in their mind, two contradictory opinions in their mind at the same time, and not be troubled by it. It's a bit like that, except it's not seeking after a resolution for those things. It's being content to have those conundrums, contradictions, paradoxes in the mind and hold them together in the mind and work with them. Keats in the field of poetry, but it can be, you can use that state of mind for other things too. And Keats presumed Shakespeare possessed this enormously, he calls it, and that Coleridge, the person who wrote the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, would seek after a more certain state of mind, and in doing so, he let go. You could see how he let go of certain very good images, poetic images, etc. Now, the fact is, the contention of our podcast today is that truth and certainty are not really synonymous. If you've got truth, it doesn't mean to say you've got certainty. And if you've got certainty, it doesn't mean to say you've got truth. And this idea of negative capability is perhaps more akin to being in a state of truth than if you're certain about something. All right, Matt, would you like to?
Yeah, Pete, you and I talked about this several years ago, and it was kind of a revelatory thing for me. It really explained to me, it gave a term to how I believe that I probably always thought. And it's actually, for me, quite liberating. Now that I've had a few years to discuss it with you and to read from other sources, I think that there's a connection between the idea of negative capability and the idea of dialectical thought. How you can look at two opposing ideas and try to find a ground in which the two can coexist. Now, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's right. The dialectical thought is, for people who are not familiar with the term, there's a thesis, which is a proposition that you propose might be valid or true, and then there's an antithesis, which is also a proposition or an entity which is in conflict with the antithesis is in conflict with the thesis, and these in the actual sensory world, empirical world, or even in the world of ideas, these two manifestations of synthesis and of thesis and antithesis clash, and the result out of this clash is a synthesis, which is a coming together, a joining of the two, of something new is created by the joining and intermingling of the two contrary thesis and antithesis. Now, as for negative capability, one would say, a bit like a Gestalt psychology, that one would perhaps need to be able to hold the thesis and the antithesis in the mind together,
yes,
and not go seeking after melding them together like with a welding torch, but just sleeping on it even, and letting the mind do its work, let the time do its work, and let the for want of a better, the natural course of natural law do its work, and allow the synthesis to come through.
Yeah, and I think if you think about how humans learn, at least what I understand about the human learning process neurologically, that makes a whole lot more sense than waiting to get an absolute answer.
That's right, or even searching after it and digging for it. Sometimes it's best to let it lie fallow. This is psychologically speaking. Let it lie fallow in the mind. You've all heard the term sleep on it, your decision, and it works.
Yeah, and if you look at the complex world that we live in, it's so complex that consciously trying to sort your way through all of the different perspectives and opinions and spell them out will probably produce madness. Trying to get an insight by assimilating lots and lots and lots of perspectives and information and conversations, I believe is a whole lot more effective way to see patterns that other people might not notice. One of my favorite writers, Jacques Ellul, said that that's essentially what he would do whenever he wrote books. He said he wouldn't actually start out to write a book in a formal academic sense. He would just collect articles. He had a folder for each article, and then he kept notes. And then he would just keep these notes, keep the articles, and then he would just let a topic sit. He would put it over in his filing cabinet or on the corner of his desk, and he wouldn't come back to it for weeks, months, or years. And then...
Like a good brew.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a good wine, a good beer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whenever it was ready, he would know it was ready, and he would go back and he would review the notes, he would reread the articles, and then he would formally, academically start writing the book, which is the exact opposite of the way that generally you're encouraged to write.
Certainly. If I could just extend this a bit, Matt, into what I call in the cloud. That's the phrase I used, and the analogy or the simile comes from cloud servers and things like this, and even the cloud of witnesses saying. But if you look at language, you look at culture, you look at society, social, all those three things are like a cloud. In that one word depends for its meaning in the context of other words. And there's no absolute definition to any word. There's satisfactory definitions, but there's no perfect definitions. And there cannot be, because because of this dependence of each word on every other word in a language. Likewise with culture and the those objects of art, which are art, poetry, music, which say in the canon, in the classical canon, they're there not by any sort of degree of certainty. They can fall out the canon. Others can come into the canon over time, and they're there, as it were, by way of a cloud. If you're understanding what I'm getting.
Yeah, I get you. Makes sense. Go ahead.
And society, again, the way people intermingle and interact, it's very much a closed area, and it's closed, but it has amorphous sort of linings, which can expand, contract, go into any shape. And so these three things, language, culture, and society, social interaction, are all, as it were, they behave like clouds, like being in the cloud. And this, of course, means if there's no certainty to any word, what any word means, where is how can you get truth from language? Likewise with culture and society, how can you get hold of truth in the sense of truth being certainty? And this leads me to believe that we should look for truth elsewhere and believe certainty in the sense of what we mean generally by certainty cannot be attained through language, culture, or society. You want to add anything on that, Matt?
No, I'm quite happy with that. That's good.
Yeah. Well, so this bit of truth elsewhere, and if we go back to the negative capability, the fact, is this the truth when we are able to hold these different things in the mind, which may conflict in actual fact or in some way, mentally or psychologically, but hold them without seeking to fuse them, without seeking the certainty that a resolution of these things that conflict would mean. Is this near a truth? Is this near a truth? It might sound a bit mystic. It might even sound a bit Buddhist, I suppose.
Yeah.
But is this near a truth than anything we say?
I think it's as close to rational truth as we'll ever get, because of the construct, the way our brains work. And if we were to make an AI, it would work in the same way. So ultimately, this ability to let go and let our engines of our mind work, it is, I think, just, vital. In fact, to go against it is insanity. I don't know if you've ever heard of a theory of personality. I think it's called IFS theory.
Not me, no.
Well, basically, the idea is that there is no single personality in the mind, and that you are composed of a multitude of personalities, and that in order for you to get harmony or peace, you have to get all the different personalities accepting one another. And of course, like any psychological hypothesis, this is highly speculative, and I think probably more metaphorical than anything. But it has some appeal to me because I know that I have many sides in the way I think. I can think from different perspectives. And if indeed this negative capability is the way that we find an approximation of truth, and maybe that's the way we should say it, an approximation of truth, then we have to also factor in all those personalities we have, perhaps, in our minds, all of the different needs that might conflict with one another, all of the different knowledge that might throw us into a range of possible understandings. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I understand. And I think two things come out of that. Firstly, I want to say briefly, there's a religious aspect to this that you talked about peace of mind. Well, the peace of God, the peace that passes understanding, is perhaps in some way allied or related to or parallel or in some way analogous to this sort of attempt to harmonise the disparate parts of your experience which make up your mind.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing I wanted to say is about AI, artificial intelligence. If you look at language, for instance, take language, for instance, any of those three things I said before, language, culture, society. Language, if you've got a word, and if you're trying to make something like a poem, and you want what you feel is the exact word, now, not as, it's not certainty, it's a whole response of your being to the word. Now, you can pick a word and you can say to yourself, that word is either better than the last one you had or not so good, better or worse. It's a comparative. And you can go on tinkering until you either get the word that you feel is the best you can get or is spot on, whatever. Now, in AI, you've got, for the most part, it's built on binary, which is two characters, 0 and 1. And that can do anything we do on our screen, 0 and 1. It does everything we do on our screens.
Yeah.
Likewise, this 0 and 1 somehow sort of, to me, might sort of correlate to this better and worse, this either or, better or worse. And as it were, by way of better and worse, trial and error, you get to the point where you either get the word that you feel is the only one suitable, or you get to the word which you think is the best compromise. Now, of course, I haven't thought this through completely, but it does seem to me that Jacques Derrida, he had a concept called difference. It isn't English difference, it's difference with an A. It's a French neologism, I think. And he would really say that the essence of human thinking, of intelligence, of any manifestation, was the differentiation of difference, the distinction of difference, making distinctions, changing, seeing where things differ, seeing how far into things, how things differ. And the further into things you can see how they differ, the more able you were to make sense of the world. I don't know if that's his actual, or whether I've drawn that conclusion, but I certainly think that all this ties up together.
Oh, and, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think also that, as it were, being in the cloud and these relative things of better and worse, 1 and 0, this is what it's like. Say the idea that atoms are a process, or atomic particles are processes, or they're information rather than there being material things. And so these things are relations rather than they are objects. And if that's true, likewise, language is a relation, culture is a relation, society is a relation, and it doesn't quite pass over into AI, because you're talking about numbers, and numbers. We maybe Matt, you could do another one on numbers, and I could just sit there and interpose, because numbers are a different sort of category of language, and that would be an interesting talk.
Well, you mean like the connection between numbers and reality?
Well, yeah, I don't want to get off the subject now, but just to be brief.
That is a very interesting thing to bring up, because I believe that there is a misconception that somehow mathematics dictates reality. And there's nothing that could be further from the truth. Indeed, there is a great coincidence between mathematics and reality. No doubt about that. Greeks noticed that 2,000 plus years ago. Babylonians, actually, Egyptians, all of the ancients understood that you could observe mathematical patterns. But what I think you see by the end of the 19th century is that the thinkers at the end of the 19th century were realizing that there were physical things that you couldn't model with mathematics, and that there were problems you couldn't solve with mathematics. So, as far as does math reflect reality? Well, it's coincident with it, but does math encompass the totality of what is out there? No, it doesn't. And I think that is, relevant to what we're talking about, because people will say, is it scientific? Is it mathematical? Is it statistical? And it is, yeah, but to say that by itself is the truth and that we can get certainty through numbers, very, very, very misleading. And that also brings you to the idea of the prevalence of statistical reasoning.
That's right.
Yes, statistical reasoning is very deceptive, because statistical reasoning doesn't account for uniqueness. It only measures diversity. And it tries to say that in the norm of the bell curve should reside what people ought to be. And that's, I think, suicidal, because it's in tails of the bell curve and in the norm, not just in the tails, but in the whole body of the statistical distribution, that we find the ability to be sentient, that we find the ability to survive. And by assuming that by picking the middle of the bell curve, that's the ideal, that's a recipe for extinction. It's not a recipe for surviving or thriving. And I think that's what we're looking for. What are we looking for here? We might say in some abstract spiritual sense, we're looking for truth. But in reality, what we're looking for is to survive and to flourish. And the only way you're going to do that is by having a broad, diverse perspective on reality and being able to adapt to whatever reality throws at you.
Yeah, I agree with you that statistical practice is fine. It's got severe limitations, and unless it stays within its severe limitations, it can be abused or misconstrued very, very easily. Yeah. I've got an example here of, if people are wondering what I mean by words and concepts being relative, I've got one here. The public domain, the idea of the public domain, as opposed to something which is protected by, say, a copyright. Now, this is how words, you can get tangled up in words, the following sort of path of reasoning, and you end up talking about meanings of words rather than what the public domain is, because you start off. A person will rejoinder, anything that's been published and is not within the scope of copyright is in the public domain. And you can agree with that, it's fine. That's a loose definition until you try and think, well, what constitutes published? If you send a letter to someone with something in it, is that published? If you've got a closed website where you have to sign in and you put something on there, is that published? Other examples go on. There we are. We're on what does published mean? What constitutes as published? What does and there we are. We're talking about words, meanings of words, and we've lost sight of the public domain. We have a generally cloud-like idea of what's in the public domain, and that doesn't mean to say it will be indistinct because it's cloud, but on the other hand, we can use that idea to practically to decide some a lot of things, whether they're in the public domain or whether they're in copyright. Yeah. So it's a rough and ready sort of rule or guide. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I think we're getting close to the end of the show. I really think that this topic, we haven't reached the end of it.
The surface of it. I'd like to talk at another time about how this, if everything's in the cloud and everything's related to one another for its sort of substance, where does metaphysics, God, where does this sort of religious, or I can say religious truth comes in, and how do we relate to it as people? I mean, that is a really interesting offshoot of this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do we, going to the meta-anomalies theme, how do we relate this to community and how we relate to one another?
Because it certainly brings into question new, fairly unfashionable topics like revelation and the status of revelation and the need for revelation, perhaps.
Yeah, and the meaning of revelation. What does that mean?
How do you decide something is a revelation from God, and what are the criteria, and what might establish evidence or even convince you? Yeah,
absolutely. As I would tell some of my students whenever I would have these discussions in a more Christian theological standpoint, and we talk to people who come from a very charismatic background, and they say, "Do you teach with the Spirit?" And I say, "Yes, but I probably don't mean what you mean." One final thought before we stop. Aristotle said it was a mark of an educated mind to be able to contemplate an idea yet not embrace it. Did Aristotle have a hint of negative capability whenever he said that? Perhaps he did.
There's a very funny, very old joke, but quite funny joke about that, about the intellectual is someone who can hear the William Tell overture without thinking of the Lone Ranger. That's a sort of a funny version of Aristotle, perhaps.
Well, thank you, everybody, and I would encourage you to go to our website, metanomalies.com, read our articles, listen to our podcasts. Next week, Anomalous Design will take over the podcast, and we'll be talking about a more IT-related subject. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.